Now the trumpet summons us again, not as a call to bear arms, though arms we need, not as a call to battle, though in battle we are, but a call to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle, year in and year out, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, a struggle against the common enemies of man, tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself.
Prior to the mid-1800s, armed conflicts were largely unregulated. If any treaties on how to fight were made, it was decided by the conflicting powers at the time and generally only applied for that specific engagement. Before the laws of war were established, war casualties were rarely buried and often left to rot, spreading hazardous disease and sorrow to the surrounding communities. After the scale of such horrors began to increase, many saw the need for reform to prevent such terrible things from happening. The start of large-scale civilian relief efforts began with a Swiss named Henry Dunant. In 1859, Dunant witnessed the aftermath of a horrendous battle at the town of Solferino during the War for Italian Unification. He was shocked at the sight of droves of unattended dying soldiers and did all he could to help their situation. Seeing the need for reform, Dunant became a passionate activist and went on to play a large role in the founding of the International Committee of the Red Cross in 1864 and the First Geneva Convention. Humanitarians all over the world followed suit and worked to establish guidelines pertaining to warfare. Only months before the First Geneva Convention, United States President Abraham Lincoln signed the Lieber Code, establishing appropriate conduct for United States soldiers during the Civil War. International efforts to set down guidelines and laws regarding warfare began in 1864 when humanitarians from 12 powerful European nations came together and signed the First Geneva Convention. This convention expressly protects wounded and sick soldiers from attack and maltreatment and affords them the right to medical care. It also protects those aiding hurt soldiers and recognizes the Red Cross as a neutral international organization of volunteers who seek to aid in the aftermath of disasters, both natural and man-made. In 1899 and again in 1907, international peace conferences were held at The Hague, which modified the 1864 Geneva Convention, granted the wartime rights of soldiers on land to those at sea, and established the practice of extensive diplomatic action before resorting to war. The laws of these conferences would be augmented later and become defined as the Second Geneva Convention. Soon following the adoption of these promising declarations, a great conflict would break out in Europe, the First World War. During the First World War, many soldiers, military personnel, and civilians were not treated with proper civil liberties or adequate physical protection. The barbarous destruction and mutilation of the war left many see the need for international regulation to prevent such hostility and disrespect from continuing. The use of horrid weapons such as chlorine and mustard gas, the wholesale slaughter of millions of men, acts of genocide committed by Austrian-Hungarians and Ottomans, as well as the awful treatment of POWs in the war, inspired many to act. Thousands upon thousands of Geneva Convention violations were recorded or otherwise witnessed. However, many of the crimes committed in the First World War were still considered legal under international law according to the Geneva Convention. To counter this, another Geneva Convention was held a decade after the war's end. The Third Convention affords prisoners basic and inalienable rights, including medical care, proper nourishment, protection, and respect due to their rank in their respective militaries. Additionally, it forbade the torture of prisoners, the forcing of prisoners to fight against their own country, and the use of captives as labor slaves. Finally, this convention established the types of court proceedings that could transpire against prisoners, and the principle that prisoners of war are to return to their home nations at the end of the war. After the ratification of this document, the general conditions for imprisonment of POWs greatly improved, saving the lives of many individuals in future wars. The peace following World War I would not last long, however, as in 1939, spurred on by the rise of fascist Italy, Germany, and Japan, the world was thrown again into conflict. This war was not only divided upon national, but ethnic lines, between Germans and non-Germans, between Chinese and Japanese. The dividing line between civilian and combatant became clouded as heavy bombing raids affected all belligerents of the war. Although the Third Convention established many great precedents for the treatment of POWs and combatants, they were not always successful. On the Western Front of World War II, the Western Allies and German forces treated each other as equals and strictly adhered to the Geneva Conventions. This was not universal throughout the war, however.
Back Island, there was a big cave there, and there was some Japanese that were still holed up in there that the infantry couldn't get out, and they would come out every night and mortar us, you know, we were right next to the runway, you know. So then they used, they found out that there was a cave, open place in the top of the cave, so they loaded Japanese aviation gasoline on the trucks and backed it up in there, shoved them off and shot them with machine guns and set them on fire. That drove them out.
The atrocities committed by, but not limited to, the German, Japanese, and Soviet governments during the war were undertaken on levels previously thought unimaginable by mankind. Prisoners of war were forced to work against their government, were interrogated, mistreated, tortured, and often kept in subhuman conditions. The conventions, while successful on the Western Front of the war, in France and in Italy, had failed in both the Pacific and Eastern theaters. Beyond the treatment of combatants came the genocide of Chinese, Korean, Gypsy, Pole, Jewish, and other persecuted peoples in both the Asian and European theaters of war. Committed by Soviet, Japanese, and German governments, the German Holocaust alone killed over 11 million people. The Japanese sacking and bombing of Nanking killed over 200,000, and the Soviet invasion of East Germany and Poland resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands. Motivated by the atrocities of the Second World War, the 1949 Geneva Convention was held to revise the preceding First, Second, and Third Conventions, and add the Fourth's changes. This convention was designed to protect all types of non-combatants, including civilians, medics, religious personnel, and aid workers in occupied territory. It goes on to mandate proper treatment, respect, and refuge for the protected individuals. It also states that occupying powers must allow humanitarian relief for deprived peoples in the occupied area. The pattern of revision of international law continued. 2 additional protocols were added in 1977, which together applied to both domestic and international fighting. They prohibit soldiers from posing as civilians, attacks solely for the purpose of spreading terror, and the destruction of public facilities essential to a city's survival, such as its roads or water supply. These protocols also extend to the 1949 articles to cover soldiers in self-determined wars, not tied with the government of any nation. However, despite these protocols, the conventions still require constant amendment and adaptation. Even after the passage of a Geneva Protocol in 1925 that prohibited the use of chemical weapons, the United States military, for nearly a decade after 1962, used the acutely toxic herbicide Agent Orange extensively in farms and jungles of Vietnam. This tactic ultimately poisoned great numbers of Vietnamese people, soldiers and non-combatants alike, and led to horrible birth defects for several generations in the dusted regions. In 1997, a convention to outlaw chemical weapons was held in Geneva to establish more stringent regulation of such weapons of mass destruction in response to their continued use. Another example of the convention's many flaws was observed with the deplorable treatment of Taliban and Al-Qaeda prisoners by the United States government in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, during the 2000s. Although it was addressed and outlawed by President Obama in 2009, Guantanamo Bay serves as a modern reminder for the need of regulation of war. Today, the Geneva Conventions are still effective and crucial. They establish the rights of countries, militaries, and citizens during times of great hardship and the responsibility that all participating governments share to uphold those basic rights. Although conflicts evolve and warfare advances, the most basic rights of mankind in war over the centuries have survived through the Geneva Conventions, truly a feat like no other.